This camel symbolizes the collective commitment to creating an environment where everyone feels seen, heard, valued, and truly belongs. As the flame burns, may it remind us that our individual sparks come together to create a powerful beacon of hope and unity.
We also want to add, take a moment of silence to think about what's happening in the Middle East right now. Everybody is being impacted by this around the world, and we need to make sure that we keep everybody in our thoughts and prayers.
Let's observe a moment of silence to honor the voices we lost, the challenges we face, the work that lies ahead. Let it be a moment of reflection, gratitude, and a deep sense of responsibility. Together, we journey forward with the light of unity guiding us. Thank you.
Santa Fe Community College acknowledges that the lands beneath the college are unceded sovereign lands of the Pueblo nations of Tesuque, Nambe, Powaque, San Ildefonso, Oquewingue, Cocheti, Kewe, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Zia, and Jemez, and that New Mexico's indigenous peoples, their governance, cultures, languages, and religions have been systemically attacked over centuries of settler colonial erasure. SFCC recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as the original and current stewards of the land where we learn, work, and grow. SFCC commits to recognize the collective histories and to engage in restorative actions that demonstrate inclusive support for Indigenous community members while practicing responsible stewardship of the land. By honoring and listening to Indigenous voices, SFCC will embody anti-racism through ongoing restorative action for social justice. Santa Fe Community College reconoce que las tierras que ocupa la escuela universitaria son tierras soberanas, no cedidas a las naciones pueblo de Tesuque, Nambe, Powaque, San Ildefonso, Oquewingue, Cochiti, Kewa, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Zia y Jemez. Igualmente reconoce que los pueblos indígenas de Nuevo México, su gobierno, sus culturas, sus lenguas, sus religiones han sido atacadas y borradas de manera sistémica durante siglos de dominio colonial. SFCC reconoce y respeta a los pueblos indígenas como los custodios originales y actuales de la tierra donde aprendemos, trabajamos y crecemos. SFCC compromete y reconocer las historias colectivas y a participar en acciones de acción y demuestran el apoyo inclusivo, así los miembros de las comunidades indígenas y asimismo a llevar a cabo una práctica responsable de custodiar las tierras. Al honrar y escuchar las voces de los pueblos indígenas, SFCC representa al antirracismo a través de acciones continuas que restauren la justicia social.
I'll be reading the equity statement. SFCC values the strengths and contributions across all backgrounds, cultures, and identities, and commits to examining and addressing systematic biases to deliver respect, equity, and access for all. SFC valora la fortaleza y contribución por parte de todas las reuniones, culturas y identidades y se complementan y examinar y abatir prejuicios sistémicos para brindar respeto equado y acceso a todos. Thank you.
Now, President Becky Rowley, on behalf of President Becky Rowley, she absolutely regrets that she was unable to be here today. She understands the importance and value of today's activities.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Professional Development Day. We have a great program for you today, absolutely world-class speakers and a very innovative format. I want to thank especially Dr. S.J. Miller and Marcos Maez, the co-chairs of PDAC, and the entire PDAC group for all their work in putting this program together for you today. This is a really important topic. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the center of everything that we do. I know that we're all going to learn a lot today, and have a great day. Thanks for being here.
It is now time to introduce to you a very special and esteemed guest. She is going to be our keynote speaker, but before we bring her up here, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to read to you her autobiography. Azadeh F. Osanlu, PhD, MPA, is a professor in the Division of Educational Leadership and Administration at New Mexico State University. She is formerly the inaugural co-director of the School of Teacher Preparation, Administration, and Leadership, and the Stan Fulton Endowed Chair for the Improvement of Border and Rural Schools. She completed her Master of Public Administration at the Wagner School at New York University and her PhD at Arizona State University in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. Some of her fondest memories as an educator are as a middle school teacher in the South Bronx and as a program coordinator for the Harlem Educational Activities Fund. Her research agenda focuses on issues of educational equity and inclusion, educational leadership and policy, and social justice leadership. She has 8 books published or in press, co-edited 4 special issues for peer-reviewed journals, and has more than 55 peer-reviewed publications, peer and editor-reviewed book chapters, white papers, periodicals, and policy briefs. Most importantly, she has graduated 32 doctoral students, all with research studies grounded in social justice leadership. She previously worked to increase marginalized student representation in the STEM fields through school community gardens and created the Youth Leadership Academy, a partnership with the local police department designed to improve community and police relations. She has won the Dean's Award for Teaching and Service, is a 2015 recipient of the American Graduate Champion Award, an award bestowed by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to people designing community-based solutions to help young people succeed in school, career, and life, and in 2017, won the Engage New Mexico Educator Award for her social justice work in the community. From 2020 to 2023, she served on Governor Lujan Grisham's Advisory Council for Racial Justice in New Mexico. SFCC, please help me in welcoming our keynote speaker for today's Professional Development Day, Dr. Azadeh Osanlu.
I think I'm going to have Marcos do my eulogy. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you all for having me, especially the PDAC group, and thank you all for allowing me to be here today to speak with you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Working with people is my most favorite thing. So the title of my presentation is "And the Program Went On as Planned," and I list myself as a teacher, a scholar, a leader, and a backtalker, and I'll explain that last one, although it's probably a little bit explanatory. I'm going to set the stage with a little bit of history of something that recently happened. Joanne Epps was set to retire as the senior advisor to the university president at Temple University in spring of 2023. She had been a law professor, provost, and dean of the law school. She had what could only be described as an illustrious career. Then in April, the Board of Trustees came calling. Under much scrutiny, the first Black male president in the history of the inner city Philly University since 1884 had resigned, and they asked Epps, a Black woman, to step in. She never said no, said a longtime friend and colleague. Never. She always put everyone else and everything ahead of herself, always. Then on September 19th, 2023, during a memorial service for a Black historian, Temple University acting president Joanne Epps collapsed on stage. She was gently lifted into the arms of a security officer who whisked her away quietly. There was a short prayer, and the program went on as planned. She was pronounced dead at the hospital. 2 days later, on September 22nd, 2023, Volunteer State Community College in Tennessee announced the death of their president, a 56-year-old Black woman named Orinthia Montag, who was lovingly called Dr. O by her colleagues and students. Vol State Dr. O was a champion of diversity and servant leadership, once stating, "I was attracted to Vol State's comprehensive approach to serving the community." Both women had a passion for social justice, gender issues in the academy, diversity, inclusion, and equity. Epps once stated, "Too often it doesn't even occur to women that they can run the world." So as we go through this presentation, I just ask you to keep in mind the following question. What does it mean to be in service to others as a professional committed to diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, and belonging? And what are the professional and personal costs on that road? I wanted to give you a little bit about me, even though Marcos gave me that beautiful introduction. I started my academic career in 2006 after serving as a middle school teacher. I earned associate professor with tenure in 2016 and full professor in 2019. I was an interim department head for ed leadership for a few years. And during that time, when I was asked, I replaced a department head who was removed by the new dean. I supervised 6 to 8 faculty and a few staff. And then I was asked to serve as an interim co-director for the School of TPAL for a few more years. And I was an inaugural co-director for a newly comprised school, which combined 3 departments: special ed, teacher ed, and ed leadership. There, I supervised close to 40 to 50 faculty, 75 adjuncts, and 3 to 5 staff. I was known as the cleanup woman, or what I'd like to say, Mr. Wolf from Pulp Fiction, if any of you have seen that movie. I cleaned up messes, I cleaned up budgets, I did a lot of things. I say that to say this: these positions are not popular ones. They weren't popular decisions. It's not popular to have a dean remove someone and then you be put in that place. Immediately, I was asked to clean up a budget deficit of $60,000. I was asked to deal with predatory advising by faculty I had never supervised. And I was asked to sunset several programs that were not enrolling students. More often, whenever you hear that word interim, that's a hard lot, because you're evaluating your own colleagues who are part of your department, and then you're going to have to go back and be part of that group. And those become tenuous relationships that are difficult to navigate for a whole lot of reasons. Then after I stepped down, I was the senior senator for the college, because as a full professor, it becomes your responsibility to speak up about difficult issues. And that's kind of why I call myself a teacher, a scholar, a leader, and a backtalker. So what is a backtalker? Well, I see part of my justice work as a calling, someone who raises issues that may be uncomfortable for others to discuss, and that discomfort is okay. When you do this kind of work, you have to be okay with discomfort. Because for me, social justice is in the doing and saying with a purpose, not just saying to say. I need the so what. So what are we doing? We don't just say the word social justice. Otherwise, we become mired in a tyranny of niceness and smile work. And I borrow this concept from Kimberly Crenshaw. In her forthcoming book, she has a book called Backtalker, a memoir. And in it, she says, I see my work as a talking back against those who would normalize and neutralize the intolerable conditions in our lives. Social justice writing, scholarship, activism is not talking into a vacuum. It's talking against the system of thoughts, against the assumptions, against the power that has lined up throughout history to tell some of us that we are not worthy of being full citizens. Some of our dreams are not worthy of being realized. So on this roadmap to diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and belonging, I'm going to go over some definitions, some examples, some of the costs of doing business, because there are costs, some fruit on the floor. And what I mean by that is a lot of folks talk about low-hanging fruit, but I actually think there's fruit lower than low-hanging fruit, and that's just fruit on the floor that we can go ahead and pick up and start doing things immediately. And then some final thoughts. So one of the first things I think we need to talk about is the context of a lot of universities and colleges today, and that's the rise in HSIs. So looking at some of that is, and this is statistics from 2021 and 2022, there's 571 HSIs and 401 emerging. That's a huge number. And I'm sure, as many of you know, HSIs were not created specifically to serve Hispanic students. HSIs were designated to apply to any school that enrolls over 25% Hispanic students. So it's a funding formula. And there's no specific mission of an HSI. Many HSIs were traditionally white schools that became HSIs as enrollment evolved. Thus, serving Hispanic students may not have been core to their identity or what they wanted to do. In 1994 to 1995, there were under 200 HSIs, and now there's 571 with 401 emerging. So we're looking at 972 in the next few years. It's growing increasingly hard for HSIs to get funding. In 2020, only 40% of eligible HSIs received Title V funding. So that's something that should be percolating in the backs of folks' heads. But one nice thing to see is that Hispanic students earned 1 out of 4 associate degrees in 2021 and earned 15.9% bachelor degrees in 2020 as compared to 9.2% in 2011. But I do ask the question, should HSIs have missions specific to serving Hispanic students? And that goes back to the so what, right? When we talk about social justice. It's great to be an HSI, but what's that so what piece? What is the mission specific to being an HSI? The government doesn't require one. So what's the D in diversity, the DEI we always hear about? Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, OED, diversity is defined as a practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Workplace diversity, which is important for where we are here, is composed of employees with varying characteristics, different sex, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, language, ability, military service, socioeconomic background, education, and ways of thinking. That last one is really important, ways of thinking, because how boring would it be to be in a room where we all thought the same? And although sometimes it's hard, it's important to have people challenge your assumptions and your beliefs, because that's how we get to higher levels of learning. An organization with workplace diversity is an organization that employees with a wide range of skills, talents, beliefs, and perspectives and experiences come together. What are some of the benefits of workplace diversity? There's a variety of different perspectives. You have increased creativity, problem solving, profits, improved employee engagement, better retention, improved company reputation, and improved hiring. So what do we not want? We don't want performative diversity. That's what we don't want. Performative diversity is used to convey a commitment to diversity, equality, inclusion, and we'll go over the E and the I in just a moment. It neglects to assign a policy, actions, or persons designated to bring about these efforts, Performatives are ritual social practices that are enacted over time to avoid potential litigation or scrutiny from stakeholders or employees. Performative diversity occurs when an organization or person advocates for DEI initiatives, but no practical actions or measurable indicators are undertaken to actively contribute to their achievement. What are some examples of this? Well, the first is big, showy DEI initiatives that soon stall after major socio-political events. We saw a lot of this after the murder of George Floyd. I can't even count the number of big racial justice coalitions, racial justice groups that formed after the murder of George Floyd. I was even asked to be on many of these, and then no work was done. The amount of diversity positions in universities that were put up, and then they were let go. The research is everywhere to see those. What's another example? No diversity on the leadership team. I can think of several universities, one I may work at, where all the deans are men. So there's a big pronouncement about we care about diversity, but all the leadership is male, all the deans are male. So what does that tell the people who work there? What type of leadership do they value? Avoiding direct confrontation with and discussion about DEI topics, but hanging up signs everywhere that say these are safe spaces, but you're not having difficult conversations. That's performative diversity. What's another example? Declaring an overall commitment to DEI topics, but reprimanding, whether covertly or overtly, staff and faculty who communicate concerns about these topics. So those are some examples of performative diversity, and that's not what we want. What's another thing we don't want? Backwards systems thinking on diversity. So what is backwards systems thinking? Trying to diversify our way to anti-racism by recruiting people into a racist or anti-diverse system, providing them with mentoring and other supports to ostensibly help them survive the racism we are ignoring. And then we're surprised when they leave. So that's backward system thinking. What we do want is forward system thinking. We want leaders who are prepared for diversity-based change. They can adapt to practices when applicable, and they use members within the organization to accelerate progress. They have a PDAC committee. We're accelerating progress. Active listening increases acceptance of all members, and tangible diversity efforts lead to credibility within an organization. This is a tangible diversity effort, having a professional development day like this. What is equity? Equity refers to the fair treatment of all people, so the norms, practices, and policies in place ensure identity is not predictive of opportunities or workplace outcomes. Equity does differ from equality, and I love this little graphic here that shows the idea is basically some people do have to give up so other people can get, and that's a general sort of explanation of that. I won't go deep into this because I do know another presenter has a session on this later today. What is the I? The I is the inclusion. It refers to how workplace experiences, it refers to how the workforce experiences the workplace and the degree to which organizations embrace all employees and enable them to make meaningful contributions. So how do people feel in the organization? Are they encouraged to participate? Do you see differences of people at all leadership levels? Are people encouraged to move upwards? It creates an inclusive culture. This is critical if organizations want to retain their talent and unlock the power. So what is accessibility? And I'm going to read the Office for Civil Rights definition. Accessible means a person with a disability, and let's remember disabilities can be seen or unseen. There's many forms of disability, is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner. So how does belonging integrate with all of this? Well, I think this graphic really does a good job. The graphic shows how DEI, when those things are in sync with one another, create this idea of belonging. Belonging is the feeling of security and support when there is a sense of nurturance and inclusion for members of a certain group. Some people say acceptance, but I prefer the term nurturance because it assumes the differences people are bringing are indispensable to the success of an organization. That idea of nurturance is from the Riddle scale, which was developed in 1994, which was used to measure responses towards homosexuality. And tolerance and acceptance were deemed as moderately pejorative or negative terms on her scale. So when we say we tolerate somebody or we accept somebody, that's not actually the highest level we can get to. The idea is nurturance, and we see people as indispensable. So generally, and in a visual, because I love visuals, I'm a visual learner, diversity is representation. Inclusion is behavior, belonging is a feeling, equity is systems, and justice is results. So then what is social justice? You've heard me say it several times. I consider myself a social justice leader. Well, the aim is that what we're looking for is social justice. That's what we want. And so social justice in the literature refers to human rights oftentimes, and it's centered around improving the lives of groups who have been historically marginalized. And there are 5 general principles. And the first is access. People need to have access to different levels and factors in our society, such as socioeconomic status, education, employment, and environment. And then there's equity, which we've talked about. Diversity, we have to understand diversity, embrace different cultures. Participation, and this is a huge one. Social justice requires that individuals have the opportunity and platform to participate in making the policies that affect their well-being. And that's why democratic participation is so important in our society. And the 5th principle is human rights. Human rights and social justice are intertwined, and it's impossible to have one without the other. These rights manifest in the laws that grant freedom of speech, voting, criminal justice protections, access to education, and other basic rights. And because I'm me and I'm a back talker, I added another one. The 6th principle of social justice is in the doing, not just talking, it's action. You have to have action. Without tangible change, social justice loses its potency. So what are we fighting against? We know what we're fighting for, which is social justice. What are we fighting against? And it's all the words we hear: racism, bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination. But what are these words? How do they differ? It's important to know. Racism is a personal belief in the superiority of one's race over another. It's linked to racial prejudice and discriminatory behaviors. It's the basis for social stratification. A bigot is a person who's intolerantly devoted to his or her opinions, who regards the treatment of members of a group with hatred and intolerance. Prejudice is negative emotions or evaluations towards persons from other groups. It's the primary determinant for discriminatory behavior. And then discrimination is treatment of people because of perceived covert behaviors. Microaggressions are part of that. So what are microaggressions? We hear about microaggressions a lot. Pierce in 1978 came up with this term, and these are the pro-racist behaviors. Microaggressions were originally described as racist terms, but over the years, they've been extrapolated to be applied to gender, sexual orientation, age, and health. There are 3 types of microaggressions. There are micro-assaults, insults, and invalidations. Racial micro-assaults are described as good old-fashioned racism. While explicit and overt, they're deemed micro because they're conducted on an individual or private level, and sometimes in limited settings. Micro insults are characterized as communications that convey rudeness or insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. An example of this can be when a student of color is asked, "How did you get into this honors program?" Or when someone identifying as gay is told, "You don't sound gay." And note, these communications can be nonverbal. When a female student is consistently overlooked in a STEM classroom, even though she has her hand raised, or the at-risk terminology used to describe disenfranchised and marginalized students. I always question why that terminology is still being used in educational policy. I would argue that the system is at risk of failing them, and I'm not sure why we continually label students as at risk. Micro-invalidations are communications that exclude or negate the feelings or experiential reality of people of color. This is when folks say, oh, I don't see race, I'm colorblind, I just see people as human. It's okay to see color. It's okay to see people as different. Difference is okay, and it's okay to nurture that difference. We want to nurture difference in individuals and groups in society. It's that difference that makes us great and makes us stronger as an organization. Another example of that can be staying silent when something should be addressed or corrected. Silence can be seen as complicit. But I want to be clear that we all have biases, all of us, and we don't have to be ashamed that we have biases. We just have to be aware that we have them. And what do we have to do about them? We have these biases based on our experiences and the messages we received in the media, in our home, in our community, how we were raised. Some are unconscious biases, and some are conscious biases, and some are unconscious biases beyond our control and awareness. The important thing is that if they're left unchecked, they can have an impact on our decision-making and ultimately our behavior towards people. I'm going to talk about two biases today. One are stereotypes, and these are preconceived ideas that we can apply to other folks. And these are often consciously endorsed, meaning they may be able to be controlled. The other types of biases are implicit biases. And these are thought to be the product of past experiences and deemed unconscious. So I thought this was a fun little graphic. The one on the left is be careful of stereotypes. Only one of them is a convicted felon. And I'm sure many of us know it's Martha Stewart. And then if you haven't had the opportunity to take the Harvard Implicit Association test, I highly recommend it. It's free. It's online. It would be a great activity to do, whether with a family member, a partner, a loved one, as part of the PD. But it reveals racial bias by measuring the amount of time it takes to make an association between two things. So what it will do, it will put up a picture of two people, a Black person and a white person, and it'll say, which one do you think is a criminal? And it gives you 3 seconds to answer. And it does that with a bunch of different faces and a bunch of different questions. And it is fascinating to see what your immediate reaction is and how quickly you answer. And then it will tell you what your implicit bias is towards different things. And again, it's free, it's online, and then Harvard uses it to determine how implicitly biased Americans are towards certain things. And I think now they've extrapolated it towards gender issues and other things, but it's a fascinating test. There's many kinds of bias, so many: confirmation bias, different kinds of bias. I just wanted to briefly mention gender bias, which is the tendency to prefer one gender over another. And we can see this when we look at whether leaders, who we vote for presidents, who we vote for different sorts of things. Ageism, the tendency to judge an individual's ability based on their age. I had one of my parents say that when they went to the doctor recently, and they said, this person's too young to be my doctor. And I said, Mom, that she's my age. So Horn's effect, when one bad thing clouds your opinion of an individual, or the opposite, the halo effect, when one impressive thing affects your opinion of someone else. A little more on gender bias. I love this graphic because I hear this all the time. What's the difference between being assertive and being aggressive? Your gender. This list of words here: beast, cleanup woman, aggressive, mean-spirited, scary, horribly mean, too angry, angry, the B word. Her eyebrows make her look very mean, horrible, slept with her boss to get ahead. These were all names I've been called in the last 2 years, whether on my evaluation, whether by a supervisor, whether by colleagues. I just started making a note. And what was interesting to me is that none of my accomplishments were discussed alongside this list of names, right? No one mentioned that I got us out of that budget deficit in less than 3 months. No one mentioned that after I addressed that predatory advising issue, we graduated more doctoral students in 2 years than we had for a very long time. No one mentioned that I graduated more doctoral students than any other professor in my entire college, or that in 2019, I was told by the then provost I was the youngest woman of color to earn full professor in the history of that institution down south since 1888. But they had no problem offering me this list of names up. So what are some of the other things that we are doing to women? Well, there's an issue, a phenomenon called the imposter syndrome, but I would like us maybe to consider it as a strategy. The imposter syndrome was developed in 1978, and it's a phenomenon used to describe self-doubt of intellect, skills, or accomplishments among high-achieving individuals. This condition often results in people feeling like a fraud or a phony and doubting their abilities. First and most often, it was used to describe professional women. But what's interesting to note that in 1978, the impacts of systemic racism, classism, xenophobia, and other biases were absent when the concept of imposter syndrome was developed. Many groups were excluded from the study, namely women of color. So what I would like us to do is to reframe this as a strategy. Instead of pathologizing the woman or the person as the problem, let's investigate the structural issues that persist in society. Gatekeepers, inequity in pay, racism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism, that send messages that we are not qualified when in fact we are, and that try to keep us out via taxing measures. So whenever you hear folks say that's imposter syndrome, maybe correct them or reframe them and say, maybe it's a strategy instead of a syndrome, and that I'm not going to pathologize people. So where do we have these conversations? Well, we hear a lot about spaces, safe spaces, brave safe spaces. Well, I'm not a fan of either. Safe spaces are used to describe spaces in which a person or group can feel confident that they will not be exposed to discrimination, criticism, harassment, or any other emotional or physical harm. And no, people should not be exposed to physical harm or discriminatory harm or be called terrible names anywhere. However, safety is necessary, and safety is necessary for preventing attacks and triggering others. But the process of learning about identity and privilege is not comfortable, and it's not a safe experience. It requires a willingness to step outside your comfort zone and to be challenged and to ultimately change the way we see the world. And for me, safe spaces are impossible to create because you cannot predict people's behaviors and thoughts, and you cannot completely guarantee safety, especially for people of color and minoritized and marginalized groups. You're asking a lot of them. I also think brave spaces, while people discuss them quite a bit, they're spaces where people feel comfortable learning, sharing, and growing. They're ideally inclusive of everybody, and they highlight the importance of being brave enough to enter spaces where you can be your authentic self and share your experiences. But what they don't take into account is that some of us bring our daily bravery into spaces every day, and they ignore the reality that underrepresented and marginalized communities must remain consistently brave to navigate educational sectors in every way, shape, or form. So what is another thing we can look at? And I say accountable spaces where difficult conversations are okay. The onus is equal in accountable spaces. It means being responsible for yourself, your intentions, your words and actions, and it means aligning your intent with action. It's that action piece that's really crucial in these conversations. I believe one of the fundamental purposes of an education is to give the next generation the skills to build a more just world and society. And to develop those skills, professionals need the experience of engaging with smart, talented people who they might disagree with, who they might deem problematic, and even find conflictual. And you must be able to anticipate contrary arguments, construct a robust position, and be okay with respectful and challenging conversations. We cannot just continue to avoid conflict. We have to engage with it. And you must be able to clearly communicate your boundaries, have a willingness Be willing to take actions. Know the work is hard because you're going to pay a price. And so what are those prices? I think there's 2 taxes that people pay when they do this work. You're going to pay a body tax and a mental tax, and there's racial battle fatigue and there's social justice fatigue. Racial battle fatigue is a concept developed by Smith, and he talks about the physiological, psychological, and behavioral strain exacted by groups who do a lot of work, predominantly folks of color. And he says that people of color are physically, emotionally spent in response to preparing against everyday racial microaggressions. And his studies showed the anxiety, ulcers, depression, insomnia, emotional withdrawal, anger, and high blood pressure due to racial battle fatigue. And then there's a mental tax that refers to social justice fatigue that people who do social justice work deal with, because you're always in fight mode. And then oftentimes you're met with more traumatic events, brick walls, no progress, steps backward, name calling, all sorts of things. And this can result in anger and frustration, helplessness, hopelessness, shame and guilt, and depression. So then let's circle back to Dr. Epps and the program that really went on as planned. This woman who spent 30 years at Temple. The university president spoke of her. Epps, who was planning to retire before being asked to step in, was not just an ideal candidate. She was, in all ways that matter, and many of the ways that should not, an ideal cleanup woman. She had the know-how, the cultural competency, and the community buy-in to address the campus's multitudinous challenges. Well, in my head, the fact the program went on as planned was an indignity, an inhumanity, and an injustice. And too often we think the work of fighting oppression is just intellectual, when in fact the real work is personal, emotional, spiritual, and communal. It does take a village. So what are some of the effortless ways to get started? There are. This is the fruit on the floor I spoke about earlier. So we can have diversity, equity, and land acknowledgement statements. And I think those are really important to have. But what are the actionable items that go with them? Because if there's no action behind them, then they become that performative diversity. And I think something that I thought about when I was watching TV last night was how the governor just got rid of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Task Force. And as someone who was loosely affiliated with that task force, I had asked the women to be part of it because the work they did was fascinating, and it was so groundbreaking, and it was so action-oriented. When I was on the Racial Justice Task Force, we had them come speak to us, and this group of women were not just passionate, but they had so many goals and so many action items. And when I was listening to the news last night in my hotel, and I heard that they were disbanded very unceremoniously, and they weren't even told that they were disbanded, that was just shocking to me. And I thought, now there was a group that were doing really good concrete work, and no one told them why they were disbanded. Now they have ideas why, and I have ideas why, but I'm sure everyone in the governor's office has land acknowledgement statements at the end of their emails. But look what they just did. They got rid of a policy task force that was doing amazing, important work. So those two things don't sync up together. So when you have diversity, equity, and land acknowledgement statements, you have to have goals that go with them, 1, 3, 5-year goals. I know of another university that's been fighting over a land acknowledgement statement for maybe 3 years now. And so my suggestion was, why don't we have goals? Why don't we say we're going to recruit 5 or 6 Native and Indigenous faculty? Why don't we say we're going to recruit 100 Indigenous students and make sure they graduate in 5 or 6 years and then have jobs for them when they're waiting? That would be an actionable item. Use materials, curriculum, et cetera, written by diverse groups. Ask yourself, who are the curricular materials created by, who are they created for, and who is being served? One book I always love is Howard Zinn, a Jewish immigrant. He wrote A People's History of the United States. I was first introduced to that in my freshman year in college by my history professor, and I'll never forget it. That was the first time I learned the anti-story of Christopher Columbus. And I thought to myself, why am I learning this now? Why didn't I learn this earlier? Great book. Use decolonizing methods and have culturally responsive evaluations for people. Highlight the contributions of marginalized voices in your field, institution, and workplace. Every organization must have a diversity council and group, which you all have. And then every a diversity council rep should be on every high-level administrative search and hire for every president, every dean, every et cetera. Hire diverse local vendors for campus events, which it sounds like you did. Hire diverse faculty, staff, and administration, and avoid that backward system thinking that I discussed earlier. More fruit on the floor. Assess the hidden curriculum in your organization's advertising, publications, and even hallways in your building. When I walk through the hallways of my campus, I see a lot of pictures that don't look like the people who work there or go there. Conduct diversity or social justice dispositions for mid-level managers, as well as 360 evaluations. We do a lot of evaluations, but what are the dispositions we're looking for? Evaluate folks with diversity and social justice initiatives, and we can base raise and accolades on those types of things and look at different diversity performance indicators. Socially justice nurturant pledges, what would yours look like? I've had those for a few of my classes, a few of my different units, and those work. And some people refuse to take them, which is also fascinating. They refuse to sign these pledges that they will honor and adhere to nurturing all different groups. They'll say, well, I'm okay with racial diversity, but I'm not okay with this kind of diversity. Well, then you're not okay with diversity. So, equity and diversity audits are a good standard bearer for DEI inclusion measures. Create systems where information is shared in fair, transparent, and equitable manners. Honest communication builds trust, and trust enhances belonging. There were groups recently I know who are working on salary equity audits at a public university, and they were asked to sign NDAs, which is a really curious thing for a public university. Thank you. And finally, regardless of political involvement, the work must go on. There's a lot of political involvement in this work, but it has to go on. So I'm going to skip this slide, but just know that social justice starts with the self. And what I mean by that if you can't advocate for yourself, you won't really be able to advocate for others. So always start with yourself. And don't ever let the program go on as planned. But this is the last thing I want to say. And this is, I keep a picture of this in my wallet at all times. And I do it because of this. So I'm a 9/11 survivor, but this is one of my favorite things. So Jon Stewart worked for 18 years to get the Victims Compensation Fund fully funded for 9/11 survivors, probably some of the most important heroes of our country. He worked for 18 years. He gave a really impassioned speech. This was the next day as Mitch McConnell walked by. And then a few days later, it failed again. And he's still fighting to get it fully funded. But this always reminds me that the work is never done for some of our most important heroes. And this is true act of social justice, just constantly working to get something really important done, despite how exhausting it can be. And sometimes how famous you can be, and you're fighting a big behemoth like Congress, who I think, as most of us know, can get nothing done. So thank you for listening to me today. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your time.